Okay, we are going to continue with solving trigonometric equations, day 2. So if you haven't watched the first video, make sure you go back and do that. We're going to keep coming back to those type of problems. So this one's going to look a little bit different, but in the end, it'll turn into a problem or two very similar to what you've already learned before. It's been great. So cosine squared plus 3 cosine minus 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this look more like something that you've done before. So you notice that we have a cosine squared and a cosine here. So what I'm going to kind of do is I'm going to make this look a little bit different. So instead of using cosine, I'm going to use a different variable. I'm going to call this u. So I'm going to say that u equals the cosine of a. Now, in this case, you could use essentially any variable, but this is a capital A, so I don't want to use a, just as long as they're different. Sometimes people use x, but we use x a lot, so I'm just doing u. So what happens is when I rewrite this, cosine squared, that would be u squared, and then plus 3 cosine, that's 3u, and then minus 4 equals 0. That looks like something that you've done before. That looks like a quadratic. So we need to factor this. So a couple reminders about this. We kind of have two little columns here to say that it's going to multiply to something and it's going to add to something based upon what you did. So remember, in this case, since this leading coefficient is a 1, it's just going to multiply to the c term, which is negative 4, and it's going to add up to your b term, which is positive 3. So we need to say to ourselves, okay, well, what multiplies to a negative 4 but adds to a positive 3? So you can start listing out things that do that. But if I have 4 times a negative 1, 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. And then if I add those together, I get a positive 3. So those are my two numbers. So when I go to factor this one, I would have u plus 4, and then u minus 1 equals 0. And when I would go to solve this, remember, we set each of these equal to 0. So I would set this equal to 0 and this equal to 0. Most people know by now that if it's just a u or an x plus x minus, it's just going to change the sign. So that's going to give me u equals negative 4, and then u equals a positive 1. Now, we did all that work to solve that. But I got to come back to remember the original problem had a cosine. So I got to go back and say, okay, well, I know that I used u equal cosine. So now in this case, I'm going to have to bring that back. So then that'll give me that the cosine of a equals negative 4, and then the cosine of a equals positive 1. I need to solve this. This is what we already did previous to this on the first thing. So this is basically saying what angle would the, since it's cosine, we're talking x coordinate, what angle is a cosine or the x value or x coordinate equal to negative 4? So again, we're looking at just my x values here, just that first coordinate looking for a negative 4. That doesn't have a solution. We've never had that on the unit circle, which means this part right there doesn't have a solution. So we do the same thing over here. What angle would give you an x value of 1? Well, I have a 1 right here as an x value. I got a 0, I got a negative 1, and I have a 0. So there's only one answer here. And so we'll just act like these are all in degrees. So my answer is 0 degrees. So this only has one solution. This is going to be a equals and then 0 degrees. Now, if you say 0 and 360, remember 0 and 360 are technically coterminal, which means they represent the same terminal side with the same coordinates. Not necessarily wrong, but sometimes, like we've done previous, we said between 0 and 360, including 0 and not including 360. Okay, next one. 2 sine squared plus sine minus 1. Now, the only difference between this one, we're going to do something very similar, but the difference between this one that we have to be a little careful of is we have to make sure that this leading coefficient is a 2, which means the factorization is going to be more difficult. So I'm going to do what I did before. I'm going to say, in this case, hey, u is going to equal sine. And it'll be the sine of x. I don't want to use x because I already have x there. So if I do that, that'll give me 2u squared plus u minus 1 equals 0. Now, when you guys have learned previous to this, I'll let you figure out and remember what you've done to this type of problem and how you factor it out when your leading coefficient is not 1. Each people use it differently. I'm going to use factoring by grouping, which is a little bit longer, and a little bit more algebraic. So you guys use whichever method you want to use. But a reminder, to first find out what multiplies and adds to be, it's a times c. So I have to do my a value times my c value. Well, 2 times a negative 1 is a negative 2. And this one's going to add up to the number in front of my b term, which is, again, going to be a 1. And that's my b term here. what multiplies to those different numbers. So we're looking for what's going to multiply to a -2, but it's going to add to 1. Well, your only two choices are -2 and 1, and then 2 and -1. This one adds up to a -1, but I don't want that. This one adds up to a +1. So those are my choices here. So when I rewrite this, again, I'm doing factoring by grouping. This will give you 2u squared. I'm splitting this u value into a plus 2u minus 1u. And notice that 2u minus 1u is the same exact thing as 1. So that doesn't change the value. But I'm specifically choosing that because it multiplies to a -2 and adds to a 1. This -1 I just bring down. So with factoring by grouping, we then are going to do the GCF of these two and then the GCF of these two. So here, both of these contain a u, and they both contain a 2. So I'm going to GCF out a 2u. So if I do 2 divided by 2, that's 1. A u squared take away a u is just going to be a u. So this would be a 1u or a u. And then 2 divided by 2 is 1. U divided by u is 1. So that'll give me a +1. When we did this one, whatever the third term was, whatever the sign is, in this case it's a minus, I got to bring that down. If that was a positive, I'd bring it down a positive. Now, the only thing in common with a 1 and a 1 here is just a 1. So usually we don't do this, but sometimes we have to. So -1u divided by a -1. When -1 divided by a -1 is a +1, so it's a +1u or u. And then -1 divided by a -1 is a +1. Now notice that the two things in the parentheses are identical. So the fact that this are the same, that means I'm doing it correctly. So when I go to finally finish factoring this one, what happens is I need to write that u plus 1 I see. And then the second one is going to be my GCS, what I have left over. So this goes there, and then this goes there. Now I'm able to solve this. So here, this would give you a u equals -1. This one, if you solve for, would give you a u equals 1/2. Because you're setting this equal to 0 and adding 1, then dividing by 2. But remember, we said, hey, u is equal to sine here. So I got to bring that back. So I've got the sine of x equals -1. And I've got the sine of x equals 1/2. So now we're going to do the same thing we've done before. This is saying what angle would give you a y value. Remember, y is sine. What angle would give you a y value of -1? And this one's saying what angle would give you a y value of 1/2. Let's worry about -1. So y values of -1. So I've got 0, I've got +1, 0, and then I get a -1. So one of my answers is right there. We'll talk about the degree measurements. That's 270. So one of my answers is 270. That's the only one that's going to give you a -1 as a y value. Over here, this one says what angle gives you a y value of 1/2. Well, there's a 1/2 right there at 30 degrees. There's another y equals there at 150. Let's see if I have any other at 1/2. That's a -1/2. That doesn't count. And that's a -1/2. That doesn't count. So I've got 30 and 50. So also 30 and then 150. So these, I have 3 different solutions. So notice that this one gave me the 270, and then this one gave me the 30 and the 150. Okay, one more. We're still going to kind of go along with this. This is still similar to what we did, except instead of doing the trinomial factorization, this is going to be a GCF. Both of these share a sign. So I'm just going to, I don't have to do any like a u substitution. I'm going to factor out a sign. So I take away a sine theta. So remember, whenever you're GCF, you're taking these terms, dividing them by your GCF. Well, sine squared divided by sine is a sine. And then negative sine divided by sine is a -1. And then we know by now, hey, set them each equal to 0. So that would give you sine equals 0. This one, if you solved it, would give you sine equals 1, because you would say sine -1 equals 0, and then you'd add 1 to both sides. So now we need to find these solutions. Well, this is saying what angle would give you a y value, since it's sine, of 0 degrees. So I want a y value of 0. Well, there's a y value of 0 at 0 degrees. Looking at my y coordinates only, looking for 0. There's another one right there at 180. Look around. I don't see any more y values. So this has 2 solutions to it so far. That's 0 degrees and then 180 degrees. The next one, what angle would give you a y value, because it's sine of 1? So that's 0. There's a 1, so it's at 90 degrees. Look at my y values again. That's at -1, so that doesn't count. So then this would give you 90. So notice that this goes back. The stuff that we do at the very end of the problem was the stuff that we learned how to do in that first video. So that's what you kind of have to be careful of.